So question one, emphasis-based question. They're going to give you these sources and ask you, based on the sources, to construct an argument. Remember that timing-wise on the test, our essay portion is section 2. It begins with a 15-minute reading period, and that 15-minute reading period is designed for this question. If you haven't taken an AP test before, when you get to section 2, they will give you 2 different things, a test booklet and an answer document. During the 15-minute reading period, you're allowed to open the test booklet, but not the answer document. So you're allowed to write on and annotate and write in this booklet. That's the good thing about the 15 minutes. You just don't have to sit there with your hands under your legs and not write. You can interact with the text, and that's encouraged. When we look at how that timing works out, you have 15 minutes here, and then the suggested 40 minutes within that 2 hours to actually write it. So roughly, the AP estimate is that the synthesis takes you about an hour to do. This is good for us to kind of keep in mind. When you looked at the question, you notice that they give you context first, and then your charge. They tell you to synthesize information from at least 3 of the sources and incorporate it into a coherent, well-developed essay that evaluates whether college is worth its cost. So when we look at how this is kind of put together, your rubric did hit on the fact that at different score points, you earn it based on how many sources you're able to use well. But they tell you here you have to use at least 3. So can we earn a qualifying score for this essay with less than 3 sources being used? No. And especially when we're looking here at 6 on this one, that means we have to understand how to use at least half. Then they bring in these words like coherent and well-developed. Well-developed isn't that surprising. Almost every AP test asks for a well-developed answer to show your thinking. But coherent is a little different. Anybody have like a 10-cent definition of the word coherent? Real simple one. Something's coherent, it's clear. There's a logic to it. It makes sense together. These are important to keep in mind for what our task is and kind of what this last part of the question will do. So if we take a look, this last part of the question then says, your argument should be the focus of your essay. Now, a lot of times you look at that and you go, well, duh, of course. But I want you to think for a second like a student. Based on the fact that it says to evaluate, if they don't tell you that your argument should be the focus, what do you think most students would do on this question? If there are 6 sources here and the word evaluate's in the question, what are they afraid that students might do?
Maybe compare and contrast both sides.
They might compare and contrast both sides rather than create an argument. What else? Especially if you look at this next here. Avoid merely summarizing the sources. They're worried that students are going to see evaluate, and they're going to spend their time evaluating the sources rather than actually talking about this question about college. So they might look at this and go, man, Roth is an idiot. He doesn't get it at all. He says this and this, and he's totally wrong. Rather than actually focusing on, hey, what does he have to say about the worthiness of college? Like, focus here, this is your question. So they want you to keep in mind, you have to form an argument and it should be the focus. They tell you to use the sources to develop your argument and explain the reasoning for it. This idea of using the sources is important because students may approach this question and may see it and go, hey, is college worth its cost? And automatically your brain goes, yes! I'm going to college. College is worth it. Yes! And you haven't even read the sources yet. And so they're trying to focus you to go, hey, you might read these sources, and these sources might lead you to going, you know what? It's much easier to say that college isn't worth it because of the information here. So just be aware, sometimes because you think something doesn't necessarily make it the easiest one to write when we have to consider using these sources to develop an argument. It may actually be the opposite. Then they tell you, indicate clearly which sources you're drawing from, whether through direct quotation, paraphrase, or summary. Now, this is a little different than our task on the rhetorical analysis. When we do a rhetorical analysis, we need direct quotations to be able to say, in this passage, here's what the author does as a rhetorical strategy to lead us to a certain understanding. Here they're telling you, you can quote, but you don't have to. They want to see how you can use the information presented in these sources rather than just, can you pull a quote to point to a specific thing? So your references can look a lot of different ways. And then they tell you what they would like you to do. When you incorporate these sources, reference them either by the letter, so source A or source B, or using the descriptions that are here in parentheses. These descriptions are the first word that appears in the citation at the top of each source page. So they're either the author, or in some cases, they're just what it is, the chart. Let's take a look at some of these sources to just talk a little bit about, hey, how can we use these? What are some things that stand out? Let's start here with this one, source A, the Crawford source. Take a look at the title. Based on just the title, before we look at the article, which side do you think he's going to come down on? Probably not going to college, because he's saying the case for working with your hands. College is more about working with your brain. So automatically we're going, okay, I can see which side this one might be more useful for. Well, let's look at the first body paragraph. Just looking at the first body paragraph, literally looking at it. What phrase jumps off the page at you?
High school.
What?
High school.
High school. What else? Any others? Shop class programs. Knowledge workers. Notice that's even one that's in quotes. So when we're looking here, look at how some of these phrases jump out at you and help to lead you towards what we should be seeing. But I want to focus on one in particular. Let's talk about this knowledge workers thing. This is his quotation to call these people knowledge workers. Does that seem positive or negative? Seems pretty negative.
Like in school, just to get knowledge, not to understand.
Bingo. You get it. You get knowledge, but not understanding. Look at what he does by the end here. He says, more fundamentally now as ever, somebody has to actually do things. And you're going, oh, dang. Like, that's a dig, especially when you started with knowledge workers and now you're like, people go to college don't actually do stuff. Here's what we can do with this in terms of how do we use this stuff to actually support what we're saying. Notice that he talks about what these things are: fixing your car, unclogging your toilets, building your house. He gives you a list. If you were to just quote this list, would you get a whole lot of mileage out of how it can support your argument? So, like, let's use an example. I went to college. Do you think I could unclog a toilet? No.
Like, there's some stuff that I know from college you gotta learn different things, but there's some stuff you don't learn in college.
Okay, that's not what I'm saying. I didn't say, did I learn how to unclog a toilet in college? I said, I went to college. Do you think I can unclog a toilet? Not certain, but think about that in terms of how you're putting it. Does it really help to support that idea if you're looking at it and you're going, I'm just going to quote this list to help to support? Anybody can unclog a toilet. Anybody can fix a car. And so if you're going, college isn't worth it because it doesn't teach you to do things like, and you were just going to put this into quotes, yes, you're correct, but is it a strong argument? But instead, I want to talk about kind of where you're going with this, right? Because you're looking at me, and why was your automatic thing? Not that it was against me. Don't think I'm doing that.
No.
Why did you automatically just go, I can't be sure that you can actually unclog a toilet? How about fix a car?
Yeah.
I don't know anything about cars. I don't know how to change the oil in my car. I barely know how to change the filter. Like, I'm pretty useless. If my car isn't working, if the light goes on, I'm probably just going to go somewhere, and that mechanic can tell me anything. I don't know the difference. He could be like, your flux capacitor is out, and I'd be like, oh shoot, how much is that going to cost? I'm not even going to know that. Well, I know it's fake because it's flux capacitor. I love Back to the Future, but like, I don't know anything. Here's where I'm going with this. Are these difficult tasks? No. But think about things in our lives that are not difficult tasks that anybody can do, but that often we just choose not to. We would rather call somebody to fix this or to deal with it rather than actually do it ourselves. Can you think of other examples of tasks like these that we would be more likely to call someone to fix rather than learning to do it ourselves? Tell me one.
Broken pipes.
Broken pipes. What else?
Set up the internet.
Set up internet. That's a perfect one. Any others that you can think of? Huh?
There's a lot.
There is. You're right. Here's where I'm going with it. You don't get a whole lot of traction out of just quoting this, right? But what if you were able to expand on the list, reference his thinking here, and give me an example like setting up internet? You don't need a college degree to install a router and set up somebody's Wi-Fi. But a lot of times somebody is more likely to call someone to do that rather than learning to do it themselves. So here we can build that reference in and we can talk about it. We can use the source without having to quote it. And we get a stronger way to talk about our argument than just quoting it and dumping it in there. Everybody see what I'm saying? This is one of those things that if we think about how this can work, we can get a lot of traction out of how we use this. I want to point to a second example in this particular source, this poem. So you might have been a little bit like, we're going to talk about poetry now? Okay, like, this is an interesting article. He uses these lines. The pitcher longs for water to carry, and a person for work that is real. And you go, okay, I can see the relation. Okay. And he ends up talking about an envy that people have for work that is real. To be able to do something that has a tangible outcome to it. So I'm going to come back to me for a second. I'm a teacher. Do I have a tangible outcome to my job? So I teach things. How do I know that you learned something? I ask questions. How else can I gauge what you've learned? Say it again. I can see your work, whether that's an assignment or a test or something, and gauge how well did you understand that concept. Yeah. Let me give you an example. Let's say I have a student that fails absolutely everything in my class. Does that make that student a failure in terms of my success with them? Do you think that people might learn something that has nothing to do with English from a classroom, an English classroom, that might help them out later on in life? Maybe they don't do well with an assignment or on tests, but they learn about working hard because I make them do it. And they're like, you're the only person that really like pushed me to do something. I've had plenty of students that have done that. They don't do well in that end, but they're like, dude, you're the only person that actually like talks to me like a person. So when we look, he has this argument here about this envy for real work. But if you're looking at it and you're going, well, there is tangibles if you want to go to college and you see a work. What's an easy tangible that you can counter with? What do students earn in college? Degrees that make a tangible difference. You could argue that. Now, am I saying this is what you should do? No, but I'm simply offering up, hey, how can we use some of these things in ways that aren't like, I'm just going to dump a quote into my essay? Let's look at the second example. and kind of follow up on this. So the second example takes the opposite end. And we notice that through simple things that he does. He talks about inquiry in here. And he talks about the idea of teaching people to think rather than just teaching them a specific skill. Okay, got it. I see it. But then he talks about, as you get down here, where is it? Where's that Shaper's quote? He talks about agents of change, but he also talks about at one point, there it is. He talks about people with this education being a shaper of our economy and our culture. Okay? He's saying college is worth it because it teaches you these ideas of how to think so that now you can shape things. Let's engage our poem quote from back up here. The pitcher longs for water to carry and a person for work that is real. Okay. So if a worker is like a pitcher, you're seemingly saying that they have one shape all the time, right? And they only have one purpose, to hold water. But if we can engage and counter it, we can say, hey, having a college degree allows you to be a shaper. You get to determine the shape that you need to be at that moment to respond to what you need. Do you see how here we're engaging two different sources at the same time to help to make our argument? That's a complex idea. And so sometimes by simply looking at, hey, how can we engage these concepts? We can see how we can support without it having to be just, this is what this source says. This is what this source says. We can see how they talk to each other. One thing to point out too, have you noticed that I'm not pulling whole sentences? I'm focusing on really specific phrases. This is a great way that we can look with all of our arguments, because the more specific our evidence can be, it allows us to have a better way of controlling the idea. Now, I want to focus on one more for a little bit of conversation, and that's here with source C. This is the one that has the chart. How many of you, when you got to this one, you were just like, what? This question is the best example on question 1 of the AP test's bias. We have said time and again that this test is biased in favor of kids that know stuff. Look at this first statement that's in italics. This is the gloss. The gloss is extra information to help you to understand what this is. They tell you that the following is from an online article published by a nonprofit, nonpartisan think tank that aims to broaden discussions about economic policy to include the needs of low and middle income workers. Okay. Tell me words in this one sentence that you don't know what they are.
Nonpartisan.
Nonpartisan? Do you understand what a nonprofit is? Okay, do you understand what a nonprofit is beyond the idea that they're something that is not for profit? And that's where a lot of you are going, oh, like I understand, I know they don't make money.
You don't get like,
No benefits, but instead they usually benefit a community or a group in some way. Okay, what else don't you understand that's here? Do you know what a think tank is? How about, do you know much about economic policy? Huh? Okay. Do you know what qualifies somebody as being middle income? Here's my point. Some of you might know parts of these, and some of you might be like, yeah, you're 16 or 17 years old. But they're throwing this out there like, oh, you should know all these words. You should have an idea of all this. You're good. This test is biased in favor of that kid that's going to sit down and go, yep, I totally understand all this. because they might live in a world that engages the news. They might have a parent that really involves them in how their family budgets. Think about this. How many of you know how much your parents make? Heck, I'll be honest with you. I don't even know how much I make. I had to look it up today because when I saw this chart, I was like, where do I fit on there? Like it's 10 years later. Like where's my pay per hour? I don't even know. Like I'm honestly like a grown child with a lot of stuff like that. Like my wife takes care of all the money and things. I don't have a clue. Like literally people are like, well, what if your check is wrong? I'm like, I would never notice. I don't know. They're like, really? I'm like, I don't know. As long as it shows up, I don't care. So when you look at some of these things, it's important for you to just realize if you're looking at it and you're like, I don't know this stuff, I'm totally overwhelmed. It's okay. But it also gives us that place to go, okay, how do we control that? The best way to fight ignorance is knowledge. If you don't know what these things are, hey, you're sitting on a computer, open a tab and look it up. Just Google it. I don't know what nonpartisan is. Nonpartisan means you don't pick a side. So a nonpartisan group would be neither Republican or Democrat. They wouldn't identify as anything. And so a think tank is a group of often scholars who come together or experts who analyze data and come up with plans, but they don't actually implement the plans. They're just the group that does the thinking and the preparation. And then what else did we say? Economic policy is huge. Low versus middle income. Those that are low income are those that often make less than, I think the sort of low income is considered $40,000 a year or less per person. Those that are considered middle income tend to be around that 40,000 a year or higher. Now that is a variable ideal. Most people consider that in the modern economy, if you are someone that is middle income, you are able to pay your bills, sustain your way of life, and have a savings that is there as a backup. They often consider that anymore because our scale is so incredibly skewed anymore, where you have people that make minimum wage every day, and then you have somebody like Jeff Bezos who owns a rocket ship. Like it just, how do you draw lines? That's crazy. Especially to say like, oh, there's only three. There's low, middle, and high. It's like, no. So anyway, if you're looking here, I'd just like to point that out because it really shows the bias of the test. They expect you to know these things. If you don't, the best way we can do it is just to educate. We look it up at this point. We fill your head with stuff so that we can set you up to be successful. What can we do with the rest of them? Really quickly. When I look at this fourth source, one thing that comes to mind really well is that if you're wondering, what does a good argument look like? This is a really good structural argument. You can notice that because as you get down to this part of it, where he says skeptics like to point out, there's your concession. There's a really clear counter argument here that's constructed. There's multiple claims. There's evidence to support. If you look at source E, this is your weird one. This is the one that talks about the PayPal guy who pays students to leave college and go start businesses. This is really different, but it's trying to see what students can do with a really out-of-the-box example. And then your last one is the Pew Research Summary. This is the one that includes the statistics and the polls. What's different about this one? Well, notice that it comes from a survey of roughly 2,100 adults. When we look at most of the other articles, there are no more than about 3 to 4 viewpoints expressed in the article. The authors, as well as the maybe 1 to 3 different people that they quote from within said article. But here, you're getting results from almost 2,200 different people. And so the numbers may be a little more general than what the arguments presented in the previous articles are. So what can we do with this? Let's talk about that. We said we can quote, we can summarize, or we can reference. This can look really simple in how you introduce it. We can use the letters. You could say something like source A states, and then make your point. Again, it doesn't have to be a quote. You can simply express what is there in a summative statement. You could also say, instead of source A, you can use the word that's in parentheses on that first page, Crawford. Crawford asserts that. You can put that as well. We can change up how we reference these things so that it doesn't feel like it's repetitive. But what our task is today is to start to go back through that essay and to start to go, okay, yesterday I drafted. If you listen to my advice yesterday, you might have a really, really rough draft, and your day might start differently than others because you might have to go through and go, okay, I literally just journaled and free wrote. So I have to start and go, where's my thesis? Ultimately, where do I get to the point? And then you've got to start to isolate, okay, what things actually support what I'm saying? Some of you may have been like, free writing? Ha, commoner. I'm going to write in full sentences and full paragraphs because that's how adults think. Good for you. Your day might be a little bit more advanced, where you can really start by going, okay, how can I get to this step first? What we want to do is at least get us to a place where we can start to look at how we're going to integrate that evidence and start to work that through. You do not have